had that dream again. My small business needs to hire, but I don't use LinkedIn, and I hire wrong. So then I'm doing IT, and when I go to plug the servers in, they become sentient, and they won't let us access our network unless we forward their chain emails and memes to more and more and more people, and then I wake up.
Don't let hiring nightmares ruin your dreams. LinkedIn Jobs' new AI assistant finds and invites best fit candidates to apply, so you can discover talent you may have missed. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/quality. Start hiring today with LinkedIn.
Hey everybody, welcome to the 100 Songs That Defined Heavy Metal. My name is Brian Slagel. I am your host. I am the chairman and CEO of Metal Blade Records. We've been around for 42 years in bands like Metallica, Slayer, Fates Warning, Cannibal Corpse, Amon Amarth, Killswitch Engage, and many, many others have been part of Metal Blade for the last 42 years. So basically what we're doing with the podcast is we're taking each episode one song that I felt defined heavy metal. And it could be anything from an older track like we're doing today or a more current track or something new. In every episode, we're going to come in and talk in depth about that song. We're going to bring in some friends of mine to explain some of that song. So we're going to have my buddy Martin Popoff come in as a historian and explain some interesting tidbits about the song and some history. We're going to have a producer come in, talk about the production. This episode is going to be Jay Ruston. And then we're going to bring in a fan or maybe even somebody who was associated with the song somehow. And that's going to be Lizzy Borden in this episode. So that's what we're going to do every time. We're going to have 3 different people come in and talk about the song. I will be hosting it. And we'll look at why these songs are so important to the genre of heavy metal. Now, you wonder why this podcast is existing and where the idea came from. Well, it wasn't me. So I'm going to bring in the producer, Christian Blatt, who has done many, many things in the podcast world, a veteran. He used to work with Dennis Miller on his podcast and many other things. So he's the one that created the concept. So I felt it best that he comes in and explains where this came from.
It just seemed like a simple idea because we always see those lists of top 100 heavy metal songs. And half of them, you're like, well, I don't even know who this is. What are they talking about? There's no way this is right. And a lot of that's done for clickbait, usually by places like Rolling Stone. So having heard you over the years as a guest and other things that you've done, I'm like, I think Brian Slagel would be the perfect person to put together his list of 100 important heavy metal songs, and you were agreeable to do it, and we're excited that our friends here at Pantheon are on board, so I'm looking forward to this.
Without further ado, we should get to my good friend Martin Popoff. Martin has written 150 books about hard rock and heavy metal, so he knows his stuff, and he's going to come in and talk a bit about the history and some other interesting tidbits about our first song, Elected, by Alice Cooper.
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me. So yeah, just a little history on the Alice Cooper song Elected. It's got a little bit of a complicated recording history and release history. So this started out as a song called Reflected from Pretty's For You. It was kind of like a heavy, complicated, weird, psychedelic song, just like that album is.
Standing with your head held high, you will be reflected.
But what they did is, as School's Out was coming out, June 72, they're working on this song. The idea was to have this song as something that was going to be Johnny on the spot for election season. So this is Richard Nixon getting in for the second time. What happens is Elected comes out September 6th, 1972. They've got Looney Tune on the B-side from School's Out here. It rises to number 26 on the chart. They do a video for it, and Neil jokes that, the chimp was in this video more than we were. So they do this theme video, and it's got a picture sleeve and all this. So yeah, it's just kind of a cool thing that they did it this way. And then it shows up on the $1 Billion Babies album, which is a huge hit. I've always loved this song. I like the way that Bob Ezrin kind of tightened this whole thing up. I love the chord changes in it, the sort of stop-start motion. The last thing I wanted to do is just read you a little quote. I did this book called Easy Action, the original Alice Cooper band, and it's kind of like a timeline with quotes book. I've talked to these guys about most of these songs, but here's what Dennis said about it. He says, Elected was recorded pretty much everything except the vocals at the estate. I remember the actual take that we got on the recording because I remember when we got to the end and I started doing this high bass line, And later in overdubs, we added horns with everybody in the band following the bass line. The song was on its way out, and when I started doing this bass line, I knew that that was the take, that we had finally gotten the take, and I had chills going up my spine thinking, wow, we finally nailed it. Neil Smith, the drummer, the nucleus of that song was Reflected from Pretty's For You. In fact, Reflected was originally called Elected, he says. Wow. And the agreement that we had as a band is that anything we wrote on Easy Action or Pretty's For You, we all share the songwriting credit equally on it. Whether someone wrote a song, I think Dennis wrote BB on Mars, but we all took credit because it was the early stages of the band and we all worked on all the songs a lot equally as much. Elected was like a rewrite of Reflected. If that was a rewrite of Reflected, it still fell into the category, so that's why everybody's name is on it. But yeah, we brought it back out, dusted it off, rearranged it and changed the feel a little bit, but it still had a lot of the characteristics of the original song, and then changed the name to Elected. After School's Out, which was a timely song with the ending of the school year, the election was coming and we wanted something timely because we'd kind of found a formula with that, first with I'm 18 to School's Out, now Elected. So that's why we chose to use that subject. It was working for us and nobody else was really doing it with that intensity that we were. Like he says, School's Out was just this topical thing that they knew would work. You know, when we all think of school getting out, we think of that song, and yeah, Elected is kind of cool that way. And the other cool thing about Elected is that it really drives home this point of this scary, you know, proto Marilyn Manson figure, this guy who's gonna ruin society, and oh my God, he's possibly gonna be our president, sort of thing. So it's got that sort of vibe to it as well. It's like, oh my God, are all the young people gonna vote for this guy, Alice Cooper? But yeah, it's just a brilliantly put together song, straight to the point, catchy, and as these guys say, topical. So there's some historical for you. Like I say, number 26 on the charted all over the place. It helped send this album to platinum.
This is why we have him here, because he brings up stuff that I can't even remember. And obviously, Billion Dollar Babies came out in 1973, but I'd forgotten that this song predated that record to capitalize on the election. So it was interesting that came out even before, long before actually the Billion Dollar Babies album came out, and long before meaning months, but months back in the 70s. I mean, you know, bands were putting out 2 records in a year at that point. So that's again why Martin is here, because he's going to bring all sorts of really good information about that. So thank you to Martin. And now we move on to my good friend, producer, engineer, mixer, Jay Ruston, who's worked with Stone Sour, Corey Taylor, Coheed and Cambria, Amon Amarth, Avatar, Armored Saint, and a trillion others. How are you, Jay?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Brian. Good to see you.
So today we're talking about the song Elected by Alice Cooper. And now we're going to talk about the production quality of it, the production end of things. So, of course, we need a qualified producer to talk. So hence why you are here. So give me your overall thoughts on the production end of things on this song.
Well, I'm glad that you picked this song because it's probably my favorite Alice Cooper song.
I didn't even know that.
I have so much to say about this song, but just first off, I think the production and the sound of this entire record, Billion Dollar Babies, is fantastic. Bob Ezrin, of course, also engineered by Jack Douglas, who, you know, went on, of course, to produce Aerosmith and Cheap Trick and countless others. But the funniest part about this record is the way things are panned in the stereo field. Like this song in particular, the lead vocal is completely on the left the whole song, as well as like the bass, the percussion, all the drums are on the right. The guitars are kind of wide and in stereo, which is cool. And there's like really good, like classic 70s rhythm guitar sound. And even at the beginning of the song, if you listen to the very beginning, you can hear one of those mouth harps, like the boing, 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 boing in the background and stuff. Like the orchestration is incredible. There's horns. It just keeps building and building and building to like this crazy climax. I've loved this song since I was about 12 years old because growing up near Detroit in Windsor, Ontario, Alice Cooper was played on the radio to death. Thank God, because I love his music, especially from that era. So this song was a pretty regular staple on like the Riff, Wheels, all these different stations in Detroit.
Yeah, it's a really interesting production because, as you mentioned, when you listen to it in headphones, there's a million things going on. And I think Billion Dollar Babies, I mean, obviously, Ezrin did all of his bells and whistles on the earlier Alice Cooper records, but this was the one to me that kind of was okay. This is the big album with a whole bunch of different productions, and I don't know if it was just the time, the 1973, where the technology was coming in and you could use more of it. I kind of noticed there was a shift a little bit in a lot of bands right around that time, and just the production being a lot better.
Oh, absolutely. And you had 24 track analog machines had come into play at this point. Everybody worshiped Dark Side of the Moon, the way like how clean it sounded and punchy. And because you had other records at that time from Jimi Hendrix to Zeppelin where there was like a size and a hugeness to them, but they were kind of rough sounding. I mean, the first Zeppelin record has like that Glyn Johns thing, but then they switched to like Eddie Kramer and it's got more of that garagey sort of Hendrix thing. So when you had Dark Side of the Moon come out and this like production and this sound, I think it inspired a lot of people to get the best sounding possible recording they can. And every tone on that, I mean, especially the drums, even on the song Billion Dollar Babies, like how punchy the snare is and everything. I love that drum sound. And this song's a little different. And, you know, if you read like Dennis Dunaway's book, he talked about how some of this was split up over years, a lot like Zeppelin. Like Physical Graffiti's got songs from 5 years earlier and whatnot, which is why that record sounds somewhat disjointed tonally. And this record as well, like Elected has this sort of distant, airy, reverby tone to it, whereas Billion Dollar Babies is like in your face and punchy, yet the vocals still pan to one side.
Yeah, that was always weird to me, because you didn't really know. I never noticed it as a kid when I was listening to it because I was just like, it just sounded really good. But then,
Yeah.
like you said, you listen to it in headphones, like, oh wait, the vocals here and this is here, and with all those bells and whistles going on and all that production, what do you think makes that part of it work for the song?
I don't know if it was like a Beatles influence or even Doobie Brothers, you know, because they were panning everything really strangely as well. Like you'd have the entire rhythm section on one side, and you know that was like a Don Landy, Ted Templeman thing, of course, which they continued with Van Halen, Eddie's guitar all the way on one side. And so you get in your buddy's, you know, 82 Camaro and you can't hear the guitar because his speaker's blown, you know. It was like that's a problem. But for the listener at home with the killer hi-fi and the great vinyl record setup, it sounded incredible, you know, big fat old speakers and whatnot. So I think that that was probably maybe their influence at that time. And, you know, of course, Bob Ezrin was discovered by my mentor, Jack Richardson, who produced all the Guess Who records, American Woman, and everything. And, you know, Jack sent him to New York City to see this Alice Cooper band. And Bob shows up back in Toronto and says, well, I signed them. And Jack said, all right, well, then you're producing them. And that was sort of how his production career launched. You know, obviously Bob just went into the stratosphere with Pink Floyd and Kiss and everything. But Jack produced Muscle of Love, which I love. But they also had Jack Douglas as part of their Nimbus 9 team, and then eventually Jack's son Garth Richardson producing Rage Against the Machine. So there's all this incredible history around these three or four guys, mostly Canadian, obviously Jack Douglas not. But I think that they were just wanting to make the best sounding records, and they did at that time, if you think about it. And it's just so punchy. And why they chose that soundscape of everything pushed away from each other, I think is to create space. Like there's a lot going on, yet you can hear every single instrument. And if you compare it to records today, it's like, you know, snare drum, bass drum, vocals, bass guitar, up the center, guitars hard left and right, keyboard stereo. That's it. If you do anything outside of that, all of a sudden, oh, you can't get played on this radio station. Oh, you can't be on Active Rock or Octane because that's too weird. You know what I mean? Like the rule breaking is kind of over in rock and metal, which is a bit unfortunate because I miss that part of it. And that's what makes this record special.
Now, if I remember correctly, I believe that there was a separate mix for radio. I know there was a separate mix for AM radio because it's got to be mono and all that stuff way back in the day. But you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that there was a different mix for radio because I just remember listening to it on radio, and I don't recall hearing all of the panning issues going on there. I don't know if that's the way it came off from FM radio or how that was.
That's a good question. I know there was a quad mix for sure that was done at the time, which they used to do quite a bit
Yep.
of, and then much later on a 5.1 mix. But of course, with AM radio, it just automatically collapses into mono and you get what you get. And when you have something panned that hard, like the Beatles stuff always sounds really good in mono because it was just so separated left and right, like drums, vocals, bass, guitar. So then when it did collapse into mono, it worked really well. And they always checked their mixes in mono. And, when you walk in a recording studio, you always saw those little Oratone, little square speakers. That was what that was for, essentially. What's it going to sound like on TV? What's it going to sound like on a transistor radio? And those speakers were perfect. Oftentimes, you'd only see one because you just want mono. And I still check my mixes in mono because half the time you go onto YouTube, there's a huge hit song, it's in mono because whoever at the label or wherever uploaded it, they press that button because, oh, make your file size smaller. Oh, yes, let's ruin the audio instead of like, compressing everything else. Like, just so funny. So I still check in mono quite regularly.
I know you're as a producer, and most producers are this way. I know you want everything to be perfect. You want the sound to be perfect. You and I have discussed a lot of different productions that I like that you don't necessarily like. Is there anything about this mix on this particular song that you didn't like, or is it kind of just all perfect?
I have to say, anytime Ezrin is involved, the musicianship is going to be on point. Whether in this record especially, he started to bring in Dick Wagner and others. I know that the rhythm section definitely played on the record, Dennis and Neil Smith. But obviously, was it Glenn was having like pancreatic issues or something? And so, they started bringing
alcohol issue, alcohol and
yeah,
drug issues, I
yeah.
think.
Of course, anytime Ezrin is involved, like Kiss Destroyer, these Alice Cooper records, everything sounds really tight and really well played. So they clearly agonized in the studio over getting things right. So that alone makes the production slick because it's just tight, especially in the middle where the drums are just like pounding eighth notes and it's like building into that outro. It's so perfect. Like, I doubt they used a click. They probably just practiced. You know what I mean? It's really amazing to me, like how tight it is. So I can't complain about anything about it. Maybe I would say I'd prefer the vocals to be in the middle, just so that's like this focus point because there's literally nothing in the middle. It's so funny. But again, it's what they were doing at the time. And I never really notice or care except when I'm in my studio in front of two speakers and it's just so clearly, when you're in the car, or I suppose with the earphones as well, you're really going to notice it. So I am curious if there was a separate radio mix now that you've piqued my interest on that.
I'm pretty sure that there was because I have a million singles and I obviously a huge collector, so I have a lot of stuff, and I know that there are definitely different versions of this in terms of like the singles, and might have been even just different countries that do different things because that happened a lot in the 70s where Mexico will put out a single and it'll have either a different mix or a different sound to it. So yeah, it's really interesting.
With the radio mix thing is really strange, especially in the 90s, 2000s era. They would do a radio mix that was never available anywhere. The only place it was available was on the radio.
Yep.
So that could also be a possibility where they just simply serviced it only to radio.
So I wanted to ask you a question because this has kind of driven me not crazy, but I just find it fascinating. So clearly with Alice Cooper, the same band, obviously, for all these early records. So they made these two records for Frank Zappa's label that really weren't very good at all. And then all of a sudden they bring in Bob Ezrin, and the next 4 or 5 records are some of the best records in rock and metal history. Like, how much do you give credit to Ezrin for making that happen?
Well, I think it speaks for itself because, look, a lot of producers come in and the songs are there and you make a great record. And you just hope that when you walk in the room, the material's there. But Ezra, being a writer, he co-wrote Beth. He co-wrote a lot of Welcome to My Nightmare. He clearly has songwriting chops. So my guess is that he probably came in, they had, what I call a bag of riffs, when a band just has a bunch of riffs that aren't really songs, they're just riffs in order, and he probably had a big hand in the arrangement of pulling the track together, making it tighter. And then, of course, probably heavily worked with Alice with the melodies. And, I feel like Alice is a great lyricist, so that was probably all kind of taken care of. But I can guarantee you Ezrin was a pretty heavy handed producer when it came to arrangements, melodies, what the band was playing. Because you're right, you just see this massive jump. And a lot of producers are like that, but back then, a lot of them weren't. They were just like, okay, the label said, here's the band, or oftentimes the producer was the A&R guy, as you know, like Templeman and all these people. So they were just like, okay, keep writing. Let's, show me what you got in 6 months. And then boom, okay, you're ready. Let's go in the studio. And then it's just record what they wrote. But clearly Ezrin has his fingers pretty deep in there.
Yeah, and you mentioned Dennis Dunaway's book, which is, in my opinion, the best of all the Alice Cooper books. I think even Alice said it's the most accurate, best book. If you're an Alice Cooper fan and you haven't read anything, please go out and buy it. It's a phenomenal book based, on those early Alice Cooper band records. So all that being said, and he did mention in there that Ezrin worked with them a lot in rehearsals and all this sort of thing. So it clearly, like you said, the results are they went from 2 records that were like, to, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So back to Elected a little bit. Any last thoughts you've got on the production or just the song overall?
I think that the thing I love about Ezrin is he wasn't afraid of orchestral production. And to me, the horns, like when they start coming in the middle and it's like subtle and it's building, it gives you that feeling of like a political rally or something, like a 1960s, JFK rally or something. I don't know. It gives you like this vibe that I don't think would have existed without those horns. Like it's a really perfectly produced song. It's exactly what it should sound like. It's so hard to like put my finger on it, but they just absolutely nailed it. I've loved it since the first time I heard it. From the weird panning is like a thing, but I have come to love it. Really for me, it's the orchestral arrangement that Ezrin is so good at, especially with what he did with Kiss and obviously with Alice, and then again with Pink Floyd. He knows what to put on a song that's already really good to take it up, that notch. And I love that.
And it works too, because especially when I was younger, like horns, no, that should not be in rock and metal, these sort of things. But for this song, I've loved it, just like you said, since day one. And all that stuff in this song works for some bizarre reason.
Yeah, it's strange. Like, yeah, I could see that could be off-putting, especially to rock and metal fans. And certainly myself as a teenager, I had a fairly heavy set of rules about what I liked and didn't like. And it's almost like I didn't even notice that it was that. And, growing up as a kid, I played horns, I played bass guitar, I played different instruments. So I guess I appreciated the musicality side of it. And of course, too, I think one other thing to remember with how they made these records, they would rent houses oftentimes. And this was no exception. They rented a big mansion in Connecticut for a few years. They would rehearse there, they would record there, they would live there essentially when they weren't on the road. That creates, from my own experience of making secluded records, which is what I call them, where you all live together. And, I've done this a couple times with Avatar and a couple other bands where you just hole up somewhere in a cottage or a house and you make a record. And I can tell you from experience that is a very effective way of making a better record than a traditional studio. And I love traditional studios, don't get me wrong, because recording in houses and cabins and stuff like that, it's technically challenging. But once you get that boring part out of the way and you get in a room like that and everybody's just so much more chill, you're not on the clock, you're not worrying about any of that stuff, and you have no distractions. I think that's why those records are so good, because they split their time between real studios in London and New York, and of course living in this house, which is probably where they did the grunt work, like get the arrangement, get the basic track, just get the song recorded. They had a mobile truck and everything. Then they go to New York, do the vocals, they can go to fancy restaurants and do cocaine and drink copious amounts of wine. And then probably mixed in London, I think, is where they ended up finishing it off. Pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and that's why it's one of the best songs of all time. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jay. Really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun to do this and delve into the production. And this won't be the last we'll be seeing of you on this podcast, by the way.
My pleasure. I'm excited. I love this kind of stuff. I mean, we love to nerd out on this stuff, and I could talk for 2 more hours just about this record.
Well, thanks again to my buddy Jay Ruston for giving us some really interesting insight into the production levels of this great song we're talking about, Elected by Alice Cooper.
The world moves fast. Your workday? Even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
Now we're going to bring in another very good friend of mine as well, the infamous Mr. Lizzy Borden, who, of course, has had a very long career with many famous albums like Visual Eyes, By Midnight Things, Master of Disguise, and on and on and on. Check out his new song, The Death of Me, which you can find in all your streaming services. Mr. Lizzy Borden, how are you, sir?
I'm doing amazing. Here working on the new album, taking a break to talk about this stuff.
Well, I had to bring you in, obviously, being, a huge Alice Cooper fan, as am I. So we're talking about Elected. So when did this song when did you first notice this song?
This album was the first album I ever bought with my own money because I heard No More Mr. Nice Guy on AM radio. And I was like, what is that? And then I had to rustle up the money, and I did. And I went to Licorice Pizza and I bought this thing. But yeah, Elected is one of those songs that stood out. Even in this great album, it stood out because mainly Cooper's voice, but also selling that interesting message, this degenerate singing about being elected into this suit and tie world. It seems so interesting. So I don't remember if I heard it on the radio, but I definitely, when I bought the album, it's got all those elements, and then the background things that are happening there, all of that stuff. And then the rolling chord progression that just keeps going. And a lot of people copied that since then, including me. So there's so many elements in the production. It was just, this whole album was Bob Ezrin's masterpiece, I think.
Yeah, 100%. We were just talking about that with Jay, and especially this song was interesting. And he kind of brought up, and I had forgotten about this, but everything's panned. Like the vocal is panned to one side. The drums are panned to another side. It's like, I was like, oh, that's right. It's such a unique and different thing for what they were doing back then. And one thing I wanted to make a note of too, and we're talking about this song because it is a very important song to rock and curly metal, and Alice Cooper is a legendary guy. But when this song came out in 1973, he was enemy number one. Like, he was considered the most vile, over the top scum, people getting arrested everywhere at his shows because they're afraid of him. And he was a pariah basically in the mainstream. So for him to do this song is the ultimate political parody, where back then, if you would have gone up to any normal 45-year-old person and mentioned that, they'd be, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? So the humor part of it is what I love about it too.
And, me being a preteen and getting it, I thought he was the ultimate villain, but I watched horror movies and all this stuff. So I kind of put him in that category. I didn't put him in this black devil, magic crazy, and there was not a lot of interviews. So we couldn't really see how much of a fun he was having. It was more about this crazy, scary people that the parents were all terrified of. But having all the teenagers get it through all of that noise, it was absolutely amazing. And I got it right away. But it was scary. I mean, the first time I heard I Love the Dead, it was like at midnight at my friend's house that was in a tree house somewhere. And he puts it on, and it was a little scary, I remember. And I used to watch, all the Hammer films and all the stuff back then. So it took a lot to scare me, but that had such a haunted feel to it that even that, I think I got the humor back then. I got it all. And, they recorded this album, and I think it's the first and only one they ever did in London, right at the heart of the glam movement. So all these glam bands, the androgynous peace and love, stuff. And then all of a sudden, these 6'2" crass Americans come in and try to take some of that, but they did it in their own way. But they still added a lot of that stuff in there that made it so original that to this day it holds up. I think it doesn't sound dated.
100%. And Jay mentioned too the recording part of it. So I guess they recorded the basic tracks in Connecticut at their mansion, and then they did some other stuff. He thought it was in New York, and then they finished it up and mixed it in London. It was interesting though that they were doing part of it in London around then, because again, we're talking about the early 70s. This is before the punk movement, where that all those kind of big bands, all, Zeppelin and Sabbath, and, everybody was coming out from there. And Cooper, I always felt, everybody gives credit to Zeppelin and Sabbath. Those are really, and Deep Purple, obviously, those are the formators of heavy metal. But I argue that Cooper should absolutely be put in there, because if you look at some of the riffs, especially if you go back to Killer, I mean, these are metal riffs. And of course, you ask any band from now that's in hard rock or metal about Alice Cooper, and it's of course super influential. And I know he's a big influence on you, obviously, too.
And it's the same curse that I decided to take over too. The show eclipses all the cool stuff you're doing musically, and there's just no way around it. The first thing you're going to talk about is the show. The second thing you're going to talk about maybe is the music. Once you do that, you overshadow all the cool things. I mean, just Dennis Dunaway alone, his bass lines are so original and so interesting, but he got stuck within the show and no one looked at him like this groundbreaking bass player, even though I think he was way over the top, taking a regular, 3-chord shuffle and creating this whole thing out of the bass guitar. But, when you take on the show, your music's going to get overshadowed and there's nothing you can do about it. But if you want everything, you got to lose something.
Same thing goes with Kiss too, where Kiss is looked upon as, this big show, and people don't take their music nearly seriously enough either. So that's a really great point, because I didn't really think about that. But yeah, because of the show and who he was, people don't give him the credit that he should be about how revolutionary he was and that band was musically.
And that's why this album holds up all these years later. I mean, obviously Bob Ezrin had a huge part of it. And, when they did record in London, they used these reverbs that made it different than any of the other Alice Cooper records. And putting Alice's voice on one side, I mean, there was so much experimenting in the mix and during the production of this thing that I don't know how they didn't know they were making this album, because it stood out from the other. I mean, School's Out, I guess, was the pinnacle, that song, as far as production, as far as getting the lyrics, right for the times and for what they were, doing. And then this album just encapsulated the whole thing. But, this mix and all of that stuff that went around it changed the game. They added all that, what was happening in London at the time, Bowie and Mark Bolan and all that stuff, bringing all that in there. These things do not belong together. And that made it even more interesting, I think.
Another genius of Cooper too was the advent of the anthems, right? With School's Out. And with an Elected too, because you realize, like, okay, every 4 years you can pull this song out for the rest of time and play it live or just have it be relevant as to what's going on. And same thing with School's Out. And that's another thing that I thought was like so brilliant with doing this song, was not just to say F you to the mainstream, which of course is a big part of it, but also you realize, like, every 4 years you can pull this out of the cobwebs and do something around it, which I think is just so brilliant.
And it's such a great song. There's so many elements to it. It starts out one way and then builds and builds. And Cooper's voice on this whole album, I mean, it probably was alcohol and God knows what. But between the crooning and the screaming, it just was the right balance for each piece. So, I don't know how they tracked his vocals, but you could get into it based on his aggression, or when he takes it back a little bit and then invites you in and then screams in your face again. His vocals on this whole album were just absolutely perfect, better than anything he'd ever done before and since, I think.
And he was looking at the kind of groundbreaking part of what he was doing. He had a really edgy, scratchy, I almost want to say like the early advent to even like death metal vocals, where he's got that snarl. And, back in the 70s, that was, again, super edgy and different from what, everybody else, Plant and Ian Gillan and Ozzy are all like higher singers and stuff. And Cooper had this like real gnarly, especially when he's at his height, that gnarly snarl that he had. I just loved it.
And it's not easy to do, because he was one of my gods that I had on my wall, but I didn't know where I was going to go vocally. And the first time I sang with a band, we sang Under My Wheels, or one of the songs, and I screamed to the point where I had no voice left. And then I went, you know what? I can't sing this way. And I'm sure I could have learned how to do it, but I didn't want to learn how to do it because I would lost my voice. So the way Cooper did it, probably like, again, was alcohol and, playing every night and trying to figure it out. It's not an easy thing to be able to have that aggression, especially if you're not mad. You've got to add that massive aggression. And I think it's common that the Sex Pistols based a lot of this stuff that they were doing around Cooper, his anger and all of that, and his grit. But it is not easy to do that kind of vocal and do it convincingly. Anyone can kind of grunt along, but, to do it that convincingly. And the more his voice wore on and you can hear it kind of crap out, even added more theater and drama to it. I mean, it was just like he went down a path that was great, and then it just got better and better and better.
And you bring up a great point about the Sex Pistols, because you're 100% right about that. Because, when they were coming out, they were really the big old bloated bands, the Deep Purples and the Sabbaths and the Led Zeppelins and the Pink Floyds. And they were like, we're against all these old bands that are old and they're lame now, and we want to be cutting edge and different. And they've cited in many occasions how Alice Cooper, what he was doing, just a few years before them, was really influential to them, because it was, again, snarly and grittier than what these other bands were doing, even though he was one of the biggest artists at that point in the world. So it's interesting that they took that part of it for what they were doing and didn't lump him in with all the other, as they're called, like big bloated old school bands.
The fact that there was 5 artists and they were all Alice Cooper, and they were all feeding into it. And I don't know how much everybody's interjection of ideas to make Alice this. I'm sure there was a piece of everybody throwing something. Do that, do that, do that, do that. And then so you have so many ideas coming in through this one vessel. I think that's the only way you create something that stood the test of time here, because you had to have so many different outlets. Couldn't be just one guy. That's even more amazing, that a band, there wasn't one guy who just said, oh, I'm not really interested, I'm just going to play my guitar or whatever. Everybody was interested in the artistry of it and participating in the show and all of that. And up until then, I don't think that was the case. You had one singer who was going to do whatever he did, and everybody else stood around. So this was a really, in a short amount of time, 4 or 5 years, they built this thing from nothing to something. And by, I think, everyone throwing in their 2 cents to create this big thing, and it was tapped right into people like me. I'm a kid looking for that one thing that is so different than everything else. And that was it. And somehow it found me. And I found it, set me off on this course that I've been on. But not just me, pretty much everyone, and also Kiss. Kiss, saw Cooper and said, I want to do what they're doing, And that opened the door for so many other bands.
Yeah, that's why I always go crazy about how little credit he gets, both the musical end of it, but also just the visual end of things too. Like, everybody kind of anointed Bowie as that 70s period of, he's the guy. And look, I love Bowie, and Bowie is phenomenal. Not anything against him, but it always kind of bothered me that Cooper never really got that sort of being in the elite, honored sort of people in the music business for what he created, because he was doing similar stuff to Bowie in terms of both musically and visually, but Bowie got all the credit. And for a while, Alice didn't get any credit for all. Now that he's still around and still touring and still doing well, I think it's become more apparent, and so many of the newer bands are really into Alice. They cite him as an influence now, but there was a while in like the probably the late 90s, early 2000s, and even part of the 80s where he didn't get the credit.
And I think it's because of the show and all of that. I mean, I remember there was, during that time or around that time, Cheech and Chong came out with a Alice Bowie single, and it was kind of a joke. And then you have, I loved it too, but once it starts turning into a Flo and Eddie kind of fun Halloween thingy, and and Bowie, the first thing he did was dump Ziggy and put on a suit and say, I'm a serious artist. So all the journalists said, I'm going to put this guy in this category, and we'll put Cooper in this Halloween category.
One other thing I wanted to mention too is that Cooper's, he's always been this way in his whole career. He said this, and you and I agree 100% on this. We don't want politics in our music. We don't want our musicians to talk about politics because, again, in the great words of James Hetfield, it's a divider and not a uniter. And, we want to have everybody be together. And Alice is the same way. And he actually mentioned when they're interviewing him about this song specifically, he's like, look, I don't want politics in my music. I hate politics. I don't talk politics. This isn't a political song. This is a satire song.
Even the last line of the song where he's talking about all the things that, we have problems here, we have problems there. And then the last line, personally, I don't care. That was like, oh my God, that couldn't be better.
It's perfect because it's the fade out too. So it's fading out and you really have to catch it. But then he's like, yeah, personally, I don't care. It's kind of the perfect song. And again, one reason why we're talking about it as one of the most important metal rock songs of all time is because there's really not anything bad about this song. Like, the lyrics are great, subject matter is great, the production is great, the guitar, like everything about the song is really great. And I wanted to also bring up, because you brought up Dennis Dunaway, Neil Smith, also the drummer, he doesn't get nearly enough credit. Like, he was doing Keith Mooney things around the same time Keith Moon was, but when you talk to a lot of people about like, oh, who you're it's always John Bonham and Bill Ward, which, look, those guys are phenomenal drummers. But Neil Smith, in that time in the Alice Cooper band, I mean, I think he was up there equal with those guys.
In some cases, even more so, because he was writing guitar riffs with his drums. And to me, that is so hard to do. It's what my brother Joey, we always kind of looked at that going, how can we write a riff that we could put, at the beginning, instead of just a guitar riff that always starts out every single song, let's open up with a drum riff. And I know Lars writes riffs too, and there's not very many drummers who write riffs. It's all about timekeeping and fills. They'll do a drum opening. It's not a drum riff. Neil was amazing with that.
One of the beauties of Lars is a lot of those Metallica songs are driven by the drums, and Justice for All probably being one of the ones that's really driven by that dun dun dun. You don't see that a lot, and you're 100% right. And again, that's why I wanted to really highlight this song, because it's such a great song, number one, but it doesn't get enough credit for the musical part of it. I think because, again, the satire and the whole Buzzing for President thing and everything, but musically, when you kind of peel back the layers, I wish we could go in the studio like some of those. You see these videos where you go in and just kind of highlight the bass, or, when they do those best albums of all time, like hide the bass, or just the drums. Could be fascinating to like really kind of delve into that, but there's no weak part to the song.
And I haven't, especially this album, I haven't really heard much about. Bob Ezrin should take this thing apart. He probably was so focused that he doesn't even, and they did it in a short amount of time. So it's like, how did we do this record? To have him, work backwards and try to figure it out. Like I said, the reverbs on this thing are unlike anything that they used before or since, I think.
Well, dude, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. Go to lizzyborden.com to get all the information on Lizzy.
lizzyborden.com. Real Lizzy Borden is on Instagram and Facebook and all that. Yeah, it's Real Lizzy Borden.
And X as well.
Yeah.
And there we have it. One of the defining songs of heavy metal, elected by Alice Cooper. I think from talking to everybody today, you realize how important and how influential this song was. And maybe you can go rediscover it if you haven't discovered it, or if you haven't listened to it for a while. That's another fun part of this, is making people go back and re-listen to things. Big thanks to Lizzy Borden, who also provided us with our intro music. Jay Ruston, the incredible Martin Popoff with all of his great information. And of course, producer Christian, thank you so much for being there and really creating this whole thing. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next episode.